David Nakamura covers the White House for the Washington Post, and Jill Colvin is a White House reporter for the Associated Press, and they join me now. Thanks to you both for being here. Well, President Trump's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, said this Wednesday in reference to the president's tweets, quote, "We have been saying for months that it is time to bring this inquiry to an end. The president has expressed the same opinion." Here's what he told Margaret Brennan on Face the Nation Sunday about tweets.
The New York Times is reporting that special counsel Robert Mueller is looking into whether the president's tweets, I should say, added up to any kind of obstruction of justice here. Have you advised the president not to tweet, at least not to tweet about his attorney general?
Good luck about tweeting. First of all, obstruction by tweet is not something that I think works real well. Generally, obstruction is secret, it's clandestine, it's corrupt. You don't want the evidence out in the public so it can be used against you. And I've looked at all those tweets and they don't amount to anything but the man complaining about an unfair investigation, which even if he wasn't the president, he has a First Amendment right to do that.
So, Jill, let me start with you. Does anyone in the White House seem concerned about the potential political fallout from the president's tweets?
I mean, absolutely. This is a White House where, you've got people like John Kelly who have said actively that they just don't look at the president's tweets. They would prefer not to know so that they don't have to respond to them until they reach a certain level. But I think just like the rest of us, there are officials in the White House who sort of have their phones, they sleep with their phones beside them and get woken up by that buzz of the president's tweets and look at it and go, what's setting the agenda for today? What are we going to have to deal with today? It's incredibly difficult, especially in the press and the communication shop here, for them to do any kind of forward or long-term planning because they never know what the president is going to see potentially on Fox and Friends in the morning that's going to drive his tweets, and then that's going to drive the conversation throughout the day.
And David, Giuliani also said on Face the Nation that he's going to nail down a decision on a potential Mueller interview, quote, maybe this week, maybe next week. Does that seem more or less likely now?
Well, it seems like there's a lot at stake for the president if he doesn't interview with Robert Mueller, and his lawyers have tried to set some boundaries if they were to agree to go ahead with it. But it seems like the lawyers would have a big concern that the president would fall into the trap of saying more things in an interview that contradict what he said publicly and putting himself into more legal jeopardy. So I think the general consensus is that it's unlikely that the president would go forward. But it also is true that, as you mentioned, Giuliani and others have said, let's bring this to a close. And one way to do that might be to put the president out there to answer some questions. So if they really want to finish this off, maybe they would do that. But I do think it's less likely that he would actually sit for that.
Well, Jill, Press Secretary Sarah Sanders said the entire Russia investigation was based off what she called a dirty, discredited dossier. Is that true?
That's obviously not the case. There were a number of misstatements made by the press secretary today at the podium. The president has tried repeatedly to try to suggest that this dossier, the Steele document, was the impetus for this investigation. We know that that's simply not true, but this is part of a pattern of, you've seen it from Giuliani, you've seen it from the president, of trying to discredit this investigation in any way they can. Even if Mueller's team decides that they're not going to actually prosecute the president, if they find that there is cause for that, as Mueller's team has kind of indicated that they wouldn't. The end result of this is likely some kind of report that Mueller's team would put out. And what you're seeing Trump and his team do here is work to try as much as they can to preemptively discredit whatever conclusions Mueller's team comes up with. I think Rudy Giuliani even said it himself this weekend, where he said, there's going to be Mueller's report and then there's going to be my report, kind of referring to the way that he spins it after the fact. And what they're hoping here is that the American public will be so confused, will have so many doubts, at least Trump supporters will have so many doubts about the credibility of Mueller's investigation, that regardless of what he concludes, regardless of what he says, they won't believe it.
Well, Sarah Sanders also said, David, that the president, quote, is not obstructing, he's fighting back. So against whom is the president fighting back?
Well, she did say that. I was there in the room today, and she also said that this was, these tweets were opinion and not an order by the chief executive for the Justice Department to end this investigation, or Jeff Sessions end the investigation. I think she's saying that basically he's fighting back against his reputation, and she continues to call this a witch hunt, unfair, partisan, motivated attack and to undermine the legitimacy of his entire presidency. And as Jill said, the more he says that, the more it convinces at least his base supporters and potentially Congress, which could be called into question if Mueller has some damning findings of what to do next, that in fact the report, its political ramifications should not be taken as seriously. So I think that's what the press secretary and his lawyers have said today.
Let me ask you about some other issues. Sarah Sanders addressed some of the president's political problems from last week, like tariffs and a potential government shutdown. Here's what Mr. Trump said about a shutdown on Rush Limbaugh's show Wednesday.
Here you are suggesting that you'd be willing to you'd be talking about shutting down the government if that's what it took to get this wall built. Now, the traditional Republican, no, don't say that. There you are. Oh, yeah, I'd be glad to do it if that's what it takes.
Yeah.
If people don't understand, your voters.
And the president also said a shutdown is a great political thing. Jill, have shutdowns typically been positive developments for presidents?
They have not, and this is something that Mitch McConnell and other Republicans have tried to impress upon the president, that you've got, candidates across the country who are, at this point just going to be getting into the final stretches of their race. And the very last thing that they want is the distraction of potentially having to be in Washington, of having to explain to their constituents why a Republican-controlled Congress and a president cannot push through basic funding and appropriations for the government, having to explain this degree of dysfunction when there's already so much distrust and frustration with Congress not being able to get things done. But I thought that interview with Rush Limbaugh was really fascinating because you had the president there really talking very openly about his political instincts and saying, look, I think this is good politics. I've got all these people, he specifically said these are good people, I like these people, but they're telling me that this is a bad issue for us, and I actually believe that this is a good issue for us. And the president is somebody who believes very deeply in his political instincts. He's someone who was told he was doing things wrong his whole life, who was told he was running his presidential campaign in all the wrong ways, and was emboldened by the fact that he proved everybody wrong and won. And so he's got, deep faith in his own political instincts. And so I wonder how much this is going to keep bubbling up over the weeks to come, and whether the president might decide at some point that he knows better than the rest of them.
Yeah, because the question continues to be asked, David, why push a shutdown this close to midterms, given what Jill has just spelled out there?
I think there's two things to think about. One is that the president ran on immigration, ran on the wall, and he's been criticized by his own supporters to some degree that he hasn't pushed harder to get that wall funding already. That said, it tends to rally his base, and even as he looks to the midterms, he also is looking beyond to 2020 and to maintain that intensity of support among those who were the most crucial to his election victory in 2016. And I think that, along with the idea that this, others may say this is a fight over the shutdown, but this is really a core issue for the White House. And if it already appears that it's going to be an upward battle for Republicans to maintain control of the House, which we are seeing in polls already, the president might think, look, it makes better sense to just play to my base and maintain my personal support moving forward.
Yeah, and on that point, Jill, we've seen polls actually bear out the fact that when it comes to various effects that some might say are negative effects of potential policy proposals, that in fact it's not the president who gets blamed, that oftentimes it's Congress. And so when in the minds of the American people here, could the president's instincts here perhaps be something that bear out to be true?
I mean, I think that's something that is a deep concern, among Senate and House leaders, among people who are running these campaigns on the ground, that there's this disconnect, and that for any misstep that Washington takes, especially, this perception, feeding into this perception that this is a place where nothing can get done, where they send people off, and what are they accomplishing for us? What are they doing for us? Why can't they get anything passed? What's the Republican argument for keeping these people in office when they can't get anything done? And you see a lot of, pushback of why aren't we talking more about the economy? The Republicans managed to pass this tax cut into law. We've seen some positive economic numbers. You've got a lot of folks who are saying, why are we not focusing on this? Why aren't we reminding or telling our voters about those benefits, as opposed to focusing in on what is, I think, as David spelled it out really, really well there, it's such a complicated and controversial issue that plays very differently depending on what state you're from. And especially, a lot of these Senate races are in places where, it's not Trump's base voters who are going to matter the most.
Well, let's talk about more broadly here the political perception of the president. The Washington Post reports that the president averages about 7.6 false or misleading claims a day. At a rally in Florida on Tuesday night, Mr. Trump, for instance, claimed that shoppers needed an ID to buy groceries. Now, David, you were in the briefing room when Sarah Sanders was asked about that. First of all, what has been the White House's response? And more broadly here, I want both of you to kind of weigh in on this notion of the rallies being what our Major Garrett called vindication for those 40% of voters who are still standing by President Trump, despite there being a very clear and lengthy record of false and inaccurate statements. David?
Well, Sarah Sanders was asked in the briefing room the last time Trump was in the grocery store. She said, "What does that matter?" And people pointed to the statement yesterday at the rally about having to show ID at a grocery store. And her comeback was, "Well, you do have to if you're buying alcohol." But obviously that's some sort of dodge because for the vast majority of shoppers are not having to show ID, and they're defending sort of this policy idea of asking for voting ID. During elections, which is a very controversial idea, obviously. So, I think that the Post story, or analysis of the president's record of truthfulness showed not only that he's, made over 2,000 false statements in his presidency, but that the rate is increasing, by more than twice since last year, double the amount of false statements per day. And I do think, though, that you're seeing at the rallies, obviously, the president continues to get a lot of people in the door. And a lot of support. So I'm not sure, again, that the public buys it, or at least his supporters buy it when he's charged of making these false statements by the mainstream media.
All right, we are getting the hard wrap. I'm so sorry. David Nakamura and Jill Colvin, my thanks to you both.
Thanks a lot.